starts when I say, oh, we're on air. Hello, everybody. My name is Rich. Think of me as the venue guy. I work for EngageWorks, the creative tech agency who are responsible for the Flux Innovation Lounge, the home of the new. We're very excited to be hosting the podcast today. I'd love to talk to you more about EngageWorks, but right now it's not about us. So I'll speak to you later. Otherwise, Luke, I said I'd keep it short. Over to you, my friend. You're live.
So you're listening to the Futures Podcast live from EngageWorks' Flux Innovation Lounge, a futuristic spaceship that has landed in the heart of London's design district. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this evening. So, just a quick explanation of what that was. So we use these live events to record a podcast. That'll be neatly cut into the beginning of this episode. And I just want to give you a little insight into how things will work this evening. The reason we are beholden to that screen is we are also live streaming out through YouTube and LinkedIn, as well as having an in-person audience here. Post-lockdown, it feels like the only way to do events now. So firstly, thank you. Thank you to everyone who is joining us in person and everyone who has joined us via the live stream on YouTube and LinkedIn this evening. I should have asked which camera was mine. I'll try all three. Hopefully you guys are quick enough to catch it. In a second, I'll invite our first guest, mechanical engineer Dr. Shini Somara, to the stage, and we'll have a 30-minute conversation that will be recorded as part of the podcast, and there'll be an ending to that to kind of wrap up that recording. But do stick around, don't run off, because after the wrap-up of the recording, we'll have a short break where you can experience all that Flux Innovation Lounge has to offer. I'm told there is an Apple Vision Pro, I'm told it's working, and I'm told there are very few outside of the US, so you can race to experience that. That'll be followed by another second 30-minute conversation with international human rights lawyer Susie Alegre. That again will be recorded as part of the show, so it'll have a similar start to how we just started this section here. And that will be again followed by a short break where you can go to the bar, replenish your drinks. But again, don't run off. Join us back in here because we'll have a short informal Q&A session with our speakers, including some of the questions from the live stream. And that'll be the first time we've done that. So let's see how that goes. Stick around to see how that goes is my advice. So for those watching online, there is a pinned comment in the live chat with details on how to access the moderated Q&A, or you can visit vvox.app and use the code 1241111197. That's vvox.app, and the code is 1241111197. Or you can scan the QR code that should be on your screen now. If you're not seeing me, a QR code is on the screen now. And for our in-person audience, you guys play the most important role because we need this to feel like a live recording, a live experience for our listening audience for when we edit and finally release this to the world. So please clap. Please applaud, please laugh, please gasp when compelled, and importantly, where appropriate. So just to test that, how does that sound to everybody? Yeah, I mean, that's good, but that's not going to make the cut. We actually have a microphone in the corner of the room, so I'm going to ask you again, how does that sound to everyone? All right, note to the editor, we use the second take. All right, so let's begin. As artificial intelligence becomes increasingly pervasive in everyday life, it's time to take a step back and and question many of the fundamental assumptions that are baked into its design. We're being told how this revolutionary technology will have a profound impact on humanity. Now, whether that takes the form of a yet-to-be-realized benefit or a massive existential risk is still up for debate, but nobody knows the importance of responsibly communicating the complexities of new technology better than our first guest this evening. Dr. Shini Somara's work bridges the gap between academia and media, research and education to empower the next generation of innovators and thinkers. We may find at our own peril that in a rush to develop these new thinking machines, that there may be a lack of much needed diversity of thinking. So, to show us how we might create effective, ethical and equitable innovations, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Dr. Shini Somara to the Futures podcast stage. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being at Flux Innovation Lounge. This is our experiment in live streaming and live podcasting. And your background is wildly fascinating. Part of the reason I wanted you on the show is because you were doing something I wish I could be doing, which is wandering around the world looking at wonderful scientific and mechanical innovations. But how do you think your background in mechanical engineering and science communication has informed the way in which you specifically understand new technologies?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. And how has my background informed the way I appreciate innovations? Is that the question? I think when you have a curiosity and you have wonder for the world around you, science and STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths, can be a great way to find out more. I've always been someone that wants to understand how things work, and I was that classic engineering kid that would take things apart and try and put them back together, never managed to succeed. But I always just wanted to understand the inner workings of things. And that curiosity hasn't left me. Technology has obviously advanced a lot, and I still want to understand how they work and why we need them and how we can solve problems using innovations. So it's an approach. My background gives me an approach to technology and innovation.
And how do you think you've seen your field of mechanical engineering change? I mean, it's changed quite rapidly in the last couple of years, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think as with all industries, it's become more digital. So mechanical engineering is typically gears and cogs and construction and building things and making things and prototyping, but so much of that has become digital. And I think that's a really good thing because it's increased the pace of invention. And you know, if you're considering a sort of manufacturing technique and big heavy tools, and that has gone digital, it just means there's more flexibility in the way we do things. We can get creative with the way we engineer things. So it's been mostly positive, but I think in the media we tend to hear about all the negative. And certainly in my work, I'm always wanting to bring out the good of engineering, because essentially engineers are problem solvers. And so I hope that I can convey the good through my work.
One of the things you're really focused on is all ethical considerations with regards to how we develop technologies and widening participation in the deployment and the creation of those technologies. Could you tell us a little bit about that specific work?
So can you repeat the question? Because I'm really distracted that you're very far back. Yeah, okay. So I feel like I'm doing this.
We had a whole thing earlier about where I can and can't be. I think that is the danger zone, and that is my happy zone. Okay. So
it's so non-TV of me to want to twist. Sorry if I feel like I'm It feels like I'm ignoring you. I'm not.
Well, let's ask the question another way. What do you think currently are some of the most pressing concerns when it comes to new and innovative technology?
Pressing concerns. Gosh, I mean, I'll tell you what my pressing concern is. When I talk about engineering and I invite Q&A from an audience, I don't know what they're going to ask me. And typically, one of the key questions is, why do you promote engineering when engineering can feel like it's fundamentally bad? A lot of people think that engineering is nuclear power or defense or, those kinds of technologies. And I'm not saying that engineering is not those things, but there is so much engineering that is engineered for good, trying to find genuinely good solutions to global challenges. And so I think my biggest bugbear at the moment is trying to update the public perception of engineering so that future engineers and potential people who want to consider STEM as a career know that they can have a positive impact on our future, because we are fed so much negativity about innovation and technology, and it really bugs me. So I'd like to add some hope, be positive about STEM.
Well, let's talk about adding some of that hope, because it does feel like, with what we're being told about new and emerging technologies, it's either one side or the other. Either it's going to lead to imminent doom, or it's the next innovation that you need to be part of. So when you're speaking to young individuals about how to get involved in STEM and how to be educated to prepare for this unknown future, where do we start?
I think we start young. Is the short answer. And that comes after sort of doing many talks and visits to schools and talking to college students and about STEM, and not really seeing the needle moving, particularly in engineering. We have such a low percentage of girls going into engineering. And I really tried my best to fly the flag and say, I did engineering, you can too. But I felt that I was speaking to an audience who had already made up their minds. Yeah. And one day I actually stopped and asked myself, why was it that I went into engineering? And quite simply, it's because my dad's an engineer. So it meant that from a very early age, it was normal to kind of help out with DIY. It was normal to kind of ask a million questions. It was just, it didn't feel strange that I had that curiosity. And so I think it's important to break stereotypes early, forget all this, girls can't have construction sets and can't sort of play with Lego and that kind of thing. And just normalize industries to welcome in not just different genders, but I've got a real passion for encouraging widening participation, because I think that STEM and engineering and innovation really lacks diversity and really lacks inclusion. And the reason why it's so crucial for innovation to have diversity and inclusion is because with a wide array of perspectives, we can just innovate better. And, widening participation, in other words, people who would never consider going into university or would never consider STEM careers might just consider it, might just, find a route into technological careers and could be, I always think of maybe a little girl might have the solution to something like cancer in her head. But if she's not given the opportunities to get an education, it's wasted on all of us, So
But when it comes to this term, widening participation, it's not always just about the youth, but it's also about STEM returners. There's a returning workforce that we also need to consider in how we engineer the future, I guess.
Yes, and, you know, I don't know, I'd love to know from the audience, like how many people think that technology and STEM subjects are for people who are particularly good at science, or, you know, show of hands, do people think that technology and innovation is just for physicists or just for mathematicians? Or because I think there is this kind of assumption that you've got to be brilliant at these subjects, and actually we really need all kinds of skills, particularly creative. Engineering is such a visionary, imaginative kind of career. You've got to have these crazy ideas to kind of build them and design them and prototype them. And STEM returners is another area, another sort of cohort that maybe went through an educational or training process, and then particularly for women, maybe moved away to have children, raise families, and then lack the confidence to go back in. And again, we're losing talent that way.
Yeah, well, it feels like a lot of these innovations, they are reliant on the talent pool and a diversity of thinking, as you said there. But how do you think diversity of thinking, how can it help innovation? In what ways on the ground are you seeing these sorts of collaborations occur where suddenly we're thinking differently about the future?
Well, I mean, I ran a podcast for Women in STEM, and I invited all kinds of women onto that podcast. Esteemed women had younger to older mothers, people from all ethnicities. And what was really interesting was just their motivation for wanting to go into STEM subjects. You know, if they came from developing countries, wanting to get trained up so that they could return back to their countries and build infrastructure, or, you know, and just having those perspectives just widens our perspective. You know, we're really fortunate in the UK, but having I don't want to single out any kind of groups of people, but for example, if you were building a solution for older communities in the home, for example, you were trying to make homes more safe for older individuals, you wouldn't want young graduate engineers as a team. I mean, you wouldn't just want young graduate engineers, you'd want a whole mixture. I certainly, as my parents' age, it's opened my eyes to a lot of things which I never would have appreciated in my youth. So those perspectives are crucial.
Now,
it seems so obvious.
Yeah, you know, funny sort of way it is. But how have you seen your industry change? Now, your expertise is, and let me get this right, computational fluid dynamics, and that got a resurgence over COVID. I didn't realise that, in actual fact, that was quite key to a lot of the way we were thinking about the COVID issue.
So computational fluid dynamics, or CFD for short, is the software that engineers use to visualize how gases and liquids, which are fluids, flow and how they behave. And when I was researching it for my doctorate, I mean, we're going back 20 years here, I was looking at airflow within buildings, and how that is relevant to engineers is that in the UK, in London, for example, we have many high-rise buildings, and if the air conditioning systems are not functioning effectively, you can get something called sick building syndrome, where there are pockets of air that just remain stagnant and don't move. And it's a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, because bacteria love warm, moist spaces. And so people would get sick breathing in this stagnant, toxic air. It's the same effect as what happened in the pyramids. The doors were shut, the air was kept in there for countless numbers of years, and then when the archaeologists opened the door, they breathed in all this toxic gas and it killed them. It wasn't a curse from the gods.
It was computational fluid dynamics.
Yeah. Had we had that software, we would have been able to see where pockets of air were stagnant. But CFD is also used to model aircraft wings and Formula One cars, much more sexy part of CFD. But how it applies to COVID is that by looking at how air behaves in spaces, we can see COVID particles being transported. And so CFD was really useful for looking at social distancing, a cough, like how far would it travel before it fell to the floor? And that's how we got all our measurements of, maintain a 1.5 meter distance. And if you're jogging, it has to be smaller distance because air travels with speed, and there's a lot of science behind it.
Well, the assumption is usually that's health science, but we don't realize there's a lot of engineering behind these sorts of things. There's so much in the world that requires hidden engineering.
It's all of it. It's physics, it's biology, it's all the good stuff, chemistry.
It's all the good stuff. Well, you get to play with a lot of the good stuff because you travel around the world, you create these videos, you do stuff for the BBC about communicating some of these key ideas of new technologies, new innovations. And how do you think that we can foster responsible conversations about new and emerging technologies? Because the immediate thing is to get very excited, isn't it? But that's not always the most ethical way to communicate that technology.
Yeah, I mean, when I was really deep in engineering, everything got so technical. And trying to explain, I mean, that pyramids example that I gave you took me a week of training, media training, to find, because my research was so technical, involving algorithms and Monte Carlo methods and turbulence models and all of that. And it just would go over people's heads. No, it wasn't intended. But it would lose people and it would put people off because it was so unrelatable. So the key thing that I want to do through my work is to take complex topics and translate them into a language that reaches people. Because we're doing all of this scientific research for people. It's not just money-making exercises. All the examples you've got here beside us, they're solutions to problems. And so I like to cover stories that affect people. I'm always asking myself, why would people want to know about this technology? And so my job, I feel like I'm a translator because I take very technical, complex content and make it into something that engages people and informs people.
Yeah, you say that these technologies are for people, but it feels like more and more we're hearing about technologies that aren't necessarily for people, AI being the key one. I hinted at it in my introduction there. Do you think AI, when it enters the realm of science communication, do you think it can actually help ideas and complex concepts become more accessible, or do you think it's actually going to do the adverse?
Well, I think, first of all, it's really important to research what is happening in AI because, my experience of AI is that it allows us to take very repetitive, predictable tasks, and we can get AI to do those repetitive, predictable tasks for us, which sounds dreamy. It allows us to be more creative, to do things that are a bit less predictable. It frees us up to become more imaginative. So a couple of weeks ago, I was all for that. But then when you listen to the news and you see what is happening and how it needs to be regulated, and there's a whole swathe of scary stuff going on with AI. And then as just an ordinary person on the street, when I'm going through my Instagram and I'm looking at things where I'm thinking, is that really real? I don't want to live in a world where I'm constantly doubting reality. And so I hope that AI, again, is used for good, because it could be so good if we just had good intentions with technology. But that's the same with everything, not just AI, but everything. So.
Well, I want to talk specifically about some of the audiences that you're talking to with books like Engineers Making a Difference, because it's often a younger audience who, again, are receiving the same sort of media and inputs from the external world that you are. And it's not a great advert for going into STEM if you think that the roadmap is to go and create something that's going to wipe out humanity. If that's what they're hearing, surely that's doing damage to the realm of young children wanting to get into that field.
Yeah, so whatever you just said, hear that, because that is exactly why I'm making the content I'm making. You know, I remember years ago, maybe even a decade or more ago, talking to large TV networks, and, you know, it was all about coming up with a great science idea for television. And I've always wanted to do hopeful, positive stories about tech. And back then they were saying, no one wants a do-goody story about tech. You know, they want shock and awe and horror and all of that. And it just kind of broke my heart, because there are such great stories out there. Some of them are in my book, where they're helping people. You know, the first engineer in the book has made a hand-cranked washing machine and used to work for a company that made very expensive vacuum cleaners. And he got frustrated in using his engineering skills to make better vacuum cleaners. He then packed it all in and moved to India to put his engineering skills to good use. And I don't know about you or anyone else here, like I just find those kinds of stories really heartwarming, because now his washing machines that use half the water of conventional washing machines and don't need to be plugged into electricity are being sent all over the world to war-torn countries. I mean, it's just uplifting. I want to hear about that kind of stuff.
The problem is, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't read. If it doesn't make it to the front page, so all we hear, or it seems to be all we hear, is doomerism. I shared with you briefly. I mean, the reason I've been doing this for the last decade is I really want to bring back tomorrow's world.
I'm with you.
And yet, no one at the BBC will let me. We should do it together. That's the plan. That was the reason to get you here, right? Well, you luckily got to do tomorrow's food with Dara O'Brien, so you've dabbled in that space. But it does feel that Britain especially has, post-Brexit, a self-esteem crisis when it comes to its own vision of how it operates in the future, and at least Tomorrow's World gave some of that positivist
We
mindset.
tried to bring back Tomorrow's World, the concept, with Tomorrow's Food, and it was going to be Tomorrow's Food, Tomorrow's Home, Tomorrow's whatever, communication, and there just wasn't an appetite for tomorrow's anything. And I think that's because of the world we live in today. If anyone wants to learn about the future of whatever, we just go online and we find out ourselves. We don't need someone in a studio kind of making it all like, wow. Although I personally think that would be a great show. So I'm with you on that.
I'm in so much for this then. I mean, we're trying to do a bit of wow.
Yeah,
but
we are.
But I think you are right, because it bleeds into the mindset of the individuals that you're interacting with every single day. And do you see that young individuals, that they have concerns about the future, or are they still hopeful?
Do you know, it's really interesting, because young people of today, which really makes me sound old, because I kind of am, but young people of today are so concerned about the climate. I don't know if it's just the people I'm hanging out with, but younger generations are not taking planes. They are, you know, working for startups and turning down jobs in the city where they could make loads of money, because they are so conditioned with what's going on with climate change. And, you know, Greta and various other role models are fueling that. And it's kind of interesting, because so much effort was put into how the climate is changing. And you can see the result. Now, this generation is very, very concerned and even scared. Because I remember, for one of the things I was doing, someone was talking about how their children are absolutely petrified because they have that image of like a very skinny polar bear standing on a tiny piece of ice. So they've got those images in their mind. And to me, all that says is that we're not providing the right content for young people to be positive about innovation for the future. So we've got to be really clear about what the global challenges are, because it's not just climate. We've got loads of other challenges, like how do we feed an increasing population and various other things, mobility, powering the world. Interestingly, there are two forms of nuclear power, and only recently have we started calling one of the two fusion power, because it's not as environmentally terrifying as the other type, which is nuclear fission, where you're splitting the atom. So it's all about education, and it's all about getting the message right and accurate, and conveying what you want to convey. And ultimately, it is down to money. Who's funding this information, and why? Is, I think, a question we also need to ask ourselves.
You mentioned there that this generation, they're scared almost to the point of being paralyzed, but do you also see members of the younger generation who are vivified by the challenge? Are you seeing people want to join groups who are developing solar panels or new forms of farming, or trying to solve some of these engineering challenges to overcome the climate crisis?
In all honesty, I don't see young people heading towards STEM, because I think a lot of the tools they have encourage them to become influencers, and encourage them to have a very sort of superficial persona. How are they coming across in 2D? Rather than what can they actually do with their skills. So I'm a bit concerned about that. But I hope that things get so, not desperate, but they get to a point where young people are like, right, I'm going to get I'm going to educate myself to make a difference, and they will have to, because at some point you can't avoid not having knowledge.
Well, I want to talk about that education piece specifically, because do you think we're missing some core skills in education to allow us to confront some of these challenges? Or is some of the learning happening in the same way that you're describing there? Are they self-motivated to learn through other means outside of the education system?
I think learning's changed. I think a lot of people, young and old, learn differently. I mean, if your boiler breaks, you can probably find
YouTube video.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think, and there's nothing wrong with that, as long as what you're watching is, hasn't been sort of butchered in some way. So I think it's interesting how learning happens. But I think we have to adapt to it, because when you first asked me the question, my honest first thought was, we have to stop splitting science and art. And I don't know if this happens specifically only in the UK, but when I was at school at the age of 13, I had already made a decision to go into science, and I had to drop the arts, and I really didn't want to. And so for some reason, we're forced to make decisions about how we want to train our brains at an age where we have no clue of what solutions we've yet to engineer. And particularly from an innovation perspective, I think innovation happens in that sort of grey area of the Venn diagram, where science is on one side and art is on the other. That's where innovation is sparked. And so we are almost forcing our young to be educated out of the innovation space, purely because of the way we school.
So instead of STEM, it needs to be STEAM, include the arts.
Absolutely.
Arts in there. Well, can you leave us with a little bit of hope? Is there perhaps a hopeful story?
It's been really doom and gloom.
So no, it hasn't been doom and gloom at all. But leave our audience with a little bit of perhaps a story that maybe you've seen or maybe you've captured in your book that gives you that glimmer that perhaps the kids are all right.
Well, I think the glimmer of hope that I see is that we're living in a world where if you want something done, you can actually just go and do it.
Yeah.
Gone are the days where we had to look to certain key figures and hope that they would spread the word. If you've got something to say, you can say it and hopefully it will gain traction. And so that's something I'm setting myself, which is I would like the science and arts to be combined somehow because I want to see progress and innovation. I'd love to see this, second industrial revolution because we were leaders in the first. And so I'm just going to go and do it.
Yeah.
Basically, I spent years trying to be very loyal to engineering and loyal to science and loyal to physics, and I didn't want to look at art, even though I absolutely love creative things. And now I've just got to a point where I'm like, why not? And you know what? The other day I was at an exhibition where science meets fashion, and it was absolutely amazing. The new technology in materials, in manufacturing, in design. I mean, so much technology was involved in this creative process, and I'm like, that's where it is at. That is the future. So I'm hopeful, and hopefully through my work I can spread that hope. Just take it upon myself to do that, because I'd say nobody. There are a swathe of people out there, and I want to get to know who they are and form a community. And in spaces like this, it's perfect.
Well, thankfully, those people do exist in our audience today, and I'm sure you'll be introduced to them. But if there was one single piece of advice for perhaps a young engineer watching, or someone in the audience who has children who are thinking of going to the STEM subjects, what would that one piece of advice be?
Explore.
Explore.
Find out what you like, what you don't like. Get talking to potential mentors as soon as you can. I never had mentors through my career, and if I had, I think I would have navigated in a much more sort of focused way. So, talk to companies, find out what companies are doing, follow your interests, don't feel bad about your curiosities, and also learn to fail, as in check your relationship with failure. Because I think if there's one thing that really held me back is that I never wanted to make mistakes. And as a result of trying to stay within, certain limitations, it took me longer to get to this point. So fail, and fail fast.
Well, I hope this conversation has encouraged you to explore or fail. One or the other, or both, is completely fine. And I just want to thank you for joining us for the Futures podcast live. You can find out more about Dr. Shini Somara's latest podcasts and science communication projects at drshinisomara.com. Shini's latest book, Engineers Making a Difference, is available now. And I also want to take a moment to say a massive thank you to EngageWorks for hosting us today. You can find out more about the Flux Innovation Lounge at engageworks.com/flux. If you like what you've heard, you can download the Futures podcast on your favorite podcasting app, or follow us on social media at Futures Podcast. More episodes, live events, transcripts, and found at futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking the wonderfully insightful Dr. Shini Somara. human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this evening. So that was another one of those introductions that we cut and we make into the episode. So I just want to thank everybody who has remained, everybody who has stayed with us in person, and also stayed with us on the live stream. For those watching online, there is a pinned comment in the live YouTube chat which contains details for how to access the moderated Q&A. Or simply, you can visit vvox.app and use the code 124111197, and there should be a QR code on your screen now. Just to repeat that, it's vvox.app and use the code 124111197. We are seeing comments in the YouTube live stream. If you can convert those comments into questions for vvox, we can see them in this room. So just to repeat, any questions through YouTube won't necessarily be seen unless they're posted through the vvox app. So everybody in the room, are we ready for our next guest? Yeah. All right, great. I can tell who went to the bar and who didn't. So in that case, let's begin. Today's generative AI tools seem to threaten human creativity more than they offer to increase human productivity. As such, these burgeoning technologies are fast redefining the essence of what it means to be human by impacting what we think, but more importantly, how we think. Thankfully, my guest today, international human rights lawyer Susie Alegre, is perfectly expertly placed to show us that our best defense against the dehumanizing effects of artificial intelligence might be found in our current understanding of human rights. In her upcoming book, Human Rights, Robot Wrongs, she calls for a more considered development, deployment, and governance of AI and robotics. And in doing so, she gives a pathway for us to reassert our collective humanity by embracing regulation that allows us to harness the benefits of emerging technologies whilst mitigating the risks. So, to help us ensure that the progress does not come at the expense of our most cherished human values and, most importantly, freedoms, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Susie Alegre to the Futures podcast stage. Hello, Susie. Thank you firstly for being here, and thank you for your absolutely fantastic book. And I want to start with that tricky acronym, UDHR, otherwise known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Why do you think that could be possibly our first line of defense against artificial intelligence?
Well, I think just to give a bit of the background on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and where it came from. You know, last year, the UDHR was 75 years old, so we're celebrating 75 years of having this global blueprint on what human rights and freedoms mean. And so if you think back 75 years, you know, what we were looking at was humanity reeling after the Second World War and the atrocities of the Holocaust, and really trying to set down what were the vital things that we need as humans to make sure that that could never happen again. What is the baseline of what everybody everywhere needs to be human and to flourish with dignity as a human being? If you go back and look at it, and I'd highly recommend to go back and look at the UDHR and see what rights it contains. While we often hear in the media about human rights as sort of being problematic or outdated or difficult, I think anyone would be very hard-pressed to find anything in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that they would not want for themselves and their family, and their friends. So I think it's really key to go back to this idea of what are human rights and why do they matter and what are they a bulwark against. And one of the things I found really interesting when I was researching the UDHR and the sort of background to it was seeing that even Albert Speer, who was Hitler's minister for armaments, at his trial in Nuremberg, where he offered up at least some contrition and recognition of the horrors that he had been part of, commented that every country in the world was at risk of technocratic autocracy, and that the only bulwark against that was fundamental freedoms and human rights, and that it was absolutely vital to prevent it happening again, that we remember that. And I think it's very interesting when you look at what he said. He was talking about the risks of technology in autocratic regimes and systems. It's nothing new. It's exactly what the UDHR was drawn up to prevent.
Well, the UDHR, it's such an important document. It's a historical document, but it is still relevant today. But given the sorts of technologies we have today compared to back in the 1940s, where do you think it's insufficient? Where do you think it could need perhaps improvement?
To be honest, I don't think there is necessarily a need for improvement as such. What's needed is really interpretation and application. And I mean, one of the things about the UDHR is that it is a declaration. It's not hard law. But most of the human rights laws that we have, and many other laws that don't necessarily have human rights written on the tin, have been designed to protect the rights that are in the UDHR. And one of the things I think is important about the UDHR, and the reason why I write about it as the baseline, is that it was collectively recognized and accepted globally. It's something that everybody agreed that everybody needs, and that's not necessarily the case when you look at regional human rights instruments. But what I think we do need is the development of using human rights law more directly in the ways that we address regulation, but also in the ways that we think about technology, and actually thinking about, what could possibly go wrong when you start designing, which is obviously, not necessarily how people want to look at things. When you're feeling innovative, you don't want someone to turn up and say, have you thought about the worst that could happen? But human rights law kind of says, you really need to think about those risks and to mitigate.
Should we let the non-humans in the room when we're talking about human rights? Can AI perhaps assist with adapting how we utilize these human rights in an age where we may have to encounter non-humans?
I think in principle, there may be use cases for AI that can help to protect human rights. I have to say that in most of the use cases I've seen where people are talking about tech for good, it's partly going back to what Shini was saying about lack of perspective, that you'll find people talking about things as a great idea because from their perspective, they are a great idea because they haven't understood other perspectives. So one example is, for example, I was talking to people a couple of years ago about the idea of digital ID. And I was in a room where I was the only woman. All the other people were middle-aged European men. And they were saying, no, it's fine. It's all very secure. And you only give it away if you consent. And I'm saying, well, what happens if, you're a 12-year-old girl in a refugee camp and you're not going to get food if you don't consent to give away your digital ID, or somebody is threatening to hurt your children if you don't give away your digital ID. And it was very clear that from the perspective of the people I was talking to, they couldn't understand situations where they might be coercively controlled. It just wasn't going in. It was just, well, it's all about consent. And so I think that is where it's really important that even when you're looking at technology for good or to promote human rights, that you need to have a variety of perspectives in the room to understand those loopholes and the horrendous consequences that could happen if you don't think about those loopholes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the problem space here that you're addressing through the use of human rights in your book. We hear a lot about the differentiated forms of threats that AI offers, but to you, what are the key threats?
I'm not particularly concerned about the existential risk issues, if I'm honest. For me, it's very much looking about the things that are already happening. And so if we look at things like disinformation, the information environment, the fact that these days we all pretty much get our information online, it's increasingly difficult to actually know whether the information we're getting is reliable and why it's being given to us, why we're being targeted, why we're receiving the information that we're getting, and what that then does for our ability to think for ourselves. And so that's where, for me, one of the really key rights when thinking about the future of technology is our right to freedom of thought and how we protect that. And what you'll see in the way technology has been developed, particularly in the last 10 years, is that a lot of technological innovation is about trying to get inside our heads, understand how we think and feel, use that information to then go back inside and change how we think and feel to alter how we behave or to categorize us in ways that might penalize us. So it's very difficult, if you like, to think at all about the future when we don't know how to think, if we've lost control of reliable information, because we need reliable information to be able to think for ourselves.
Well, that's the wonderful irony in your book, that to think critically about AI is a great challenge, because AI is causing the issues and the blockers to thinking critically in itself, to think critically, to form opinions freely, and to produce original creative works. And it's original creative works that I want to talk a little bit about, considering we're here at Engage Works at a design studio, because that's where we can start utilizing this framework to do the real work, to understand how AI is affecting the creative industries, for example.
Yeah, I mean, my second book that's coming out in May, the real thing that triggered it was ChatGPT, if I'm honest, and the beginning of 2023.
Was it also the thing that wrote it?
I'll leave you to decide.
Okay.
It's usually fairly obvious if ChatGPT wrote it, or at least it was in early 2023.
It wasn't ChatGPT.
Yeah.
It was beautifully written. Sorry.
But yeah, it was this sense, this sort of overwhelming feeling, which I don't know if there are other creatives in the room, but it literally made me feel sick, what I was seeing online, the complete dismissal and failure to understand what being creative is. And, you know, for me, I grew up telling myself stories, you know, writing stories. I think I won my first literary prize about a hedgehog family when I was about 7 at school. And the idea that I would get AI to write stories for me, or that, you know, that this was a force for good, and that then it's great because then we won't have to bother writing stuff ourselves, was really, it was a horror story for me. So I wanted to explore that, engage with it, and see what I thought it meant. And I think, you know, it's always quite complicated looking at these things, because, you know, you don't want to just push back because what about me? But it's about, well, what does it mean for human creativity? And I think one thing we've seen, certainly in recent years, I mean, and maybe it was always the case, that it's very hard to make a living doing anything creative. But, you know, as a writer, it was, I think in 2022, the ALCS did research on writers' incomes. So these are professional writers working full-time as writers in the UK in 2022. Does anybody want to have a guess at how much they were earning annually?
It's like any other art, so it'd probably be below the wage anyway.
50 grand.
50?
23.
23? Any advance on 23? 12? No. 7. 7,000. And with that, there's also a 40% discrepancy between men and women. So, you know, if you want something written cheaply, just ask a woman writer. Do not design an AI system to do it for you. So there's already a big problem in the arts. And you know, talking about solving problems, for me, the last thing the arts needs to solve their problems is ChatGPT. But one of the things that I found interesting then, talking to other people who were exploring generative AI, was that the people that I found who thought it was great generally came into 2 categories. One category was non-native English speakers who have to write text in English for their day job, but who speak English quite well, but it's definitely a lot quicker to get it done with ChatGPT and then sort of correct it. And the second lot of people were people who have to produce content because of the way the internet works. So because of the way the internet works, if you've got an underwear shop online, you have to be constantly producing engaging content so that the algorithm will send people your way. If anyone's on LinkedIn, this idea that you have to be constantly creating engaging content that you can't be bothered to do, but now you can get ChatGPT to do it for you, and it'll also message people for you. So it's about people who've been sort of forced into content creation, but who actually don't want to do content creation. In my view, actually, if you could, put those two groups of people, the people who like creating and the people who have to have content, and get one to pay the other to do it for them instead of paying a machine, then we would be looking at solutions to problems for creatives.
Well, is there a mindset change with how we view AI? Do we need to see it more as a collaborator? And if so, is there something within the human rights framework that allows us to I guess, harness AI for productivity, but not necessarily let it take our jobs or our creativity?
I think there is. I think, when I started again to research for the book, when you look at things like the right to work, the rights to unionize, the rights to strike, all of these things in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, you can see that actually what it gives us as societies is key tools to decide how we want to work, what we want our communities to look like. And I think one of the problems we have with the way AI is being sold is that it's being sold as a cure-all. And I remember waking up in the morning listening to the Radio 4 after the AI Safety Summit to hear Elon Musk reassuringly telling me that I wouldn't need to work anymore and that AI could be my best friend. And I'm thinking, I don't want either of those things. I actually, I enjoy working and I like my friends. So I think there's a real question about what do we want AI for? And we don't need it to do everything all the time. We need to decide what use cases it's good for, both as individuals, but also for societies.
Well, going back to the idea of perhaps value, now AI art, it's being created, it's already out there, there's a multitude of different tools that you can use, but will we as human beings ever see the cultural value in that, in the same way that we have cultural heritage for human-made artworks or even buildings or spaces and places?
I think there might be. I mean, there are some artists who are doing incredible work with AI and using AI to effectively show the issues about AI in society, if you like. So they're using it very much to make artistic points. So there are definitely useful and interesting creative ways that AI is being used in the arts. And it's very difficult to tell what we will think about it in the future. And again, going back to the distant past, Socrates was famously very against the written word because he thought it would, dull our minds and we wouldn't be able to remember anything, which, may be one of the reasons I have problems remembering people's names. But, Socrates, clearly, we wouldn't have heard of Socrates if no one had written about him. He would have disappeared into the annals of time. So I think with AI and creativity, there will be ways that it will be used and that it will revitalize creativity. But it can't replace humanity. And I think what we're going to land up with is a position where, human-made art will be a luxury item that probably only tech billionaires will be able to afford to buy, while the rest of us will be getting, the artistic equivalent of lift music is what's available and surrounding us. And so, there are arguments about, again, what do we want it to do? Where do we want it? How do we want to use it? So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing question. But I think the other thing, which is often not really talked about, is the massive environmental and power costs of AI. So every time you make a funny meme or do a video or, get ChatGPT to write a poem for you for LinkedIn, you are using large amounts of power, large amounts of water, and that is not being replenished. And so there's a kind of big question about just using it for fun, all the stuff that's happening in the background that we're not aware of at the moment.
Yeah, well, one of our last live episodes was with Corinne Kath and Fike Jensen, and they were talking exactly about that. On one hand, the EU has these climate policies where they want to reduce the amount of energy they're using, but on the other hand, they have an AI policy that requires the opening of a multitude of data centers that require both power and water, the two resources that they're trying to protect against. So it does feel like there's this cognitive dissonance when it comes to governance. And I want to turn to governance and law and legal and ask whether those are viable forms of resistance to some of these things. I know you said there it's not either or, but can we, and can, I guess, creative industries, can they adapt, regulate, or protect against the encroachment of AI?
I think one of the most important tools is access to justice, and so being able to actually enforce the laws that are there. Because one of the big things around big tech and AI is that there's been this narrative that regulation is too slow to catch up, the law can't catch up. I don't think that's true. In most cases, the laws are there, they're just being ignored, and it costs a lot of money to enforce them, and a lot of time. And so you do see things, things are starting to catch up. You see things like the FTC in the US, who are, now starting to really flex their muscles and use penalties like, I think it's called, program disgorgement, I think, where effectively they order the whole system to be destroyed if it's found to be illegal. Well, that then, creates a real risk and makes people focus their minds on getting it right before they invest tons of money in something that may well just be destroyed by a legal order. So I think the law does give us that possibility, but it's only if we have access to justice that we will make the law stick.
Yeah, well, in the interim, are there perhaps creative interventions that are being done by artists to resist the way in which AI is repurposing their work?
Yes, I think one of my favourite sort of interactions between technologists and artists was the development of two tools. One of them is called Glaze, which allows artists to effectively put a digital protective glaze over their work when they post it online to stop it being scraped by tools feeding AI. And then on top of that, if you really want to go for it, you can add an extra layer, which is called Nightshade, where if the AI does scrape your images, then it will effectively be poisoned. And so it's a way of ultimately destroying the system from within. And I think that's a really fascinating area. I mean, it remains to be seen, how the law will deal with that. I suspect someone will probably start challenging that from the opposite end.
Yeah, unfortunately, coming in down the side of OpenAI rather than the side of artists in that respect. But these issues that always come up when we have this discussion about creativity and how it collides, I guess, with AI. The keywords are copyright, ownership, and originality. But thankfully, as you prove in your upcoming book, the UDHR, that has articles in it that can help us deal with those complicated issues.
Absolutely. I mean, Article 27 of the UDHR, which you hardly ever hear spoken about sort of as a human right, but it actually gives artists moral and economic rights in their work. So moral rights, sort of the right to be recognised for your work. It also gives communities access to science. And I think that's what's really important, is that there is this protection of, if you like, the totality of human innovation, and to make sure that it's there for our societies. One of the things that I really noticed when I started looking at ChatGPT out of my despair was that I did what a lot of people in my LinkedIn area did, was ask ChatGPT who I was, which of course it basically said I was nobody. Which is fine. I was, a bit hurt, but anyway. So then I asked it, well, who wrote Freedom to Think, which was my first book? And it came back with, I think it was an Australian biologist first. And so I was like, well, no. I went and checked, no, he hadn't written that book. And I asked it again and again and again, and it gave me 20 different names. And all the names were men, all white men, and the only one woman I got was a woman called Dr. Bobby Stevens, and I assume that that's because
just two
she was
male
probably
names.
two men. Yes, so she was a man squared as far as ChatGPT was concerned, because only men would think about, freedom of thought and these sort of profound issues. But then when I asked it if it could write in the style of Susie Alegre, it was very happy to do that, and it even really helpfully said it could do a better job if I fed it some more copyrighted work that it could use as a model. And what was interesting as well was that it gave synopses of the book. So it clearly had come across the book somewhere, or at least reviews or something, but it didn't ascribe it to me. So that kind of question of moral rights, I think we'll find increasingly with what is effectively automated plagiarism and the erasure of women from their own work.
When it comes, again, to the process of education, I'm seeing at the University of Warwick undergraduate students using ChatGPT to write their essays, essentially. Now, the smart ones, they pay for ChatGPT-4, and then they upload all the papers they should have read, and then they get it to write an essay that's at least referencing things that are real.
Yeah.
So, but learning from that, it makes me realize that there are ways to use these tools as collaborative, and there are ways for us to teach the next generation to use their critical thinking skills to critique what they're receiving from these seemingly authoritative AI tools.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question of using it effectively as a tool to take apart the argument that you're being given by ChatGPT and to describe why it's potentially wrong. I think as well, from an education perspective, I think it's going to be a real struggle, but one ray of hope for me is that what it will mean is that the way we educate people, the way we learn, will turn into a much more interactive exercise. Because clearly the essay is dead. There's no point in sending someone off to write an essay in 2024, but actually then having a discussion live and engage, much more interpersonal engagement, I think could be the upside.
Yeah, practice-based research. Make a thing and then respond to the thing as the form of your essay, because it's very hard for ChatGPT to understand what the thing is that is out in the world. Otherwise, now, Susie, you are in the legal profession, and we all heard the news and the rumours that the legal profession's over. We don't need lawyers anymore. Great. They're not going to become cheaper, but we won't need them anymore. But obviously, you have an insider view on that, and that is speculation. Do you think there are some risks to the legal profession of AI entering that profession? And equally, are there any benefits, perhaps, of integrating AI?
There's definitely a lot of sales on law tech. Whether or not any of it would replace actual lawyers, I am much more sceptical. And I think what's going to be interesting is the cases brought by lawyers when the law tech drops them in it at some point in the future. Because I saw an interesting piece of research just before Christmas where there were generative AI models, I can't remember which ones, there were 2 or 3 of them, where they trained it on federal judgments, so they were actual judgments, and asked them to analyse or to say what the judgment said. So there's a real judgment, they fed it, asked what it says. Apparently, they got it wrong between 69 and 88% of the time.
Wow.
And that's not fed on rubbish from across the internet. That's fed on actual judgments and asked to analyse them. So I think we're a long way off having to worry too much about it. But on the flip side, you'll end up with people like, I think the last one, again, just before Christmas, was Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, whose pro bono lawyer in his criminal case apparently used ChatGPT to write the pleadings, and unfortunately most of the cases cited were non-existent. And it was just, the latest in a string of, particularly out of the US, we've seen these headlines of lawyers turning up at court with pleadings based on cases that just don't exist. So I think we'll probably see quite a bit more of that. Whether or not that will shore up the position of lawyers for the future, I don't know.
Well, it certainly feels like there's a long way to go and a lot more innovation to be done. But if we are to make the argument that human beings are fundamentally special, they sit in a plane beyond something that AI can pardon me, that AI can replicate, what do you think it is that is the value add of being a human in the 21st century?
I think the value out of being a human is the capacity to change, the capacity to be perverse, the capacity to decide things differently. So I think the thing that really gives me hope is that we do have that capacity. We still have the opportunity to choose, and to choose what it is that we think is important about being us, each other, and our communities.
Well, on that exact note, is there perhaps one piece of advice that you would give our audience to ensure they can stay human in the age of AI?
I'd say just think very carefully when you're using AI about why you're using it, what it's for, and what the consequences of you using it might be. And they may not be very obvious just yet. But the one concrete example I'd say of that is when you use Google Maps, which I admit I did use just around here, but it took me the wrong way, although we got here in the end, is that Google Maps apparently is actually affecting our brains and our ability to find our way in the real world. So if you think that that's happening just with following GPS, what on earth is it doing to our brains to rely on them to write our essays, to think our thoughts, and to create our ideas for the future?
Wow. Okay, so preserve your thoughts before it's too late and something else does the thinking for you. On that note, I just want to thank you for joining us on the Futures Podcast Live. You can pre-order Susie's new book, Human Rights, Robot Wrongs, by visiting susiealegre.com. Her 2022 book, Freedom to Think, Protecting a Fundamental Human Right in the Digital Age, is available now. I want to take this moment to say a massive thank you to EngageWorks for hosting us today. You can find out more about Flux Innovation Lounge at engageworks.com/flux. If you like what you've heard, then you can download the Futures Podcast on your favorite podcasting app or follow us on social media at Futures Podcast. More episodes, live events, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking the wonderfully insightful Susie Alegre to the Futures Podcast. You don't have to be. You can be raucous if you want. So thank you again. Thank you for staying. We're entering our Q&A aspect of the event tonight. This was wholly an experiment in many ways. So pre-lockdown, we did about 120 different events in London. They usually ran for a full 90 minutes, and they were panels and book talks and God knows what else. Post-lockdown, we're trying to get this hybrid model right. So if you do have any feedback, hopefully constructive criticism, I'm open to hearing it. Please do send us an email. If you've got any ideas for the format and the way we can improve it, please let us know. And equally for the online audience, if there's more forms of interactivity that you would like, please let us know as well. We are learning throughout this process. So I do have to say, for those watching online, there is a pinned comment in the live chat with details on how to access the moderated Q&A. You can visit the vivox.app and use the code 124111197. And again, I think there should be a QR code on the screen that you can scan, or it has the instructions with that little Q code. And I'm seeing some questions come in now, so we'll see if we can balance those two. Now, for those in the room, you get to use your voices. That's very exciting, or unless you want to use the Vivox app, which you're entirely allowed to as well. I do come with a quick caveat, a quick warning in how I run Q&A, and that warning goes like this. The microphone is rigged, so if anyone makes a statement that doesn't end in a question mark, they will suffer a short, sharp, but non-lethal electric shock. If you say something along the lines of, this is more of a comment than it is a question, then I can't guarantee that electric shock won't be deadly. Of course, I'm joking. That would be a legal nightmare for me and for EngageWorks, but thankfully I've got a lawyer next to me. But that doesn't stop me from wishing it was a future where that was possible. So despite my warning, I am genuinely interested and excited to hear your questions, but please be respectful of your fellow attendees. So does anyone want to kick us off with the first question? Just at the back here.
This one's for Susie. So if I understood right, you're kind of saying the laws are already there, whether it's UDHR or whatever, to kind of stand up against some of the things that are happening with AI and all the rest of it. I'm just wondering, like, why aren't they being used? So why are governments kind of putting their hands up and saying, we can't do anything, it all goes too far? You know, what's your take on the real reason behind that people not using those?
I think firstly, I wouldn't necessarily say all the laws there. So I think there is scope for law reform, but I think that the protection of our rights is already there, and that there are ways of using, for example, GDPR. It's not just about data protection, it's about data protection to protect all the rights that are in the EU Charter, which reflect the rights in the UDHR. Action being taken requires strong regulators who are heavily funded and have powers to bring those kind of cases. For individuals to bring those cases is incredibly risky, costs-wise, and long, and a very difficult process. It's not easy to bring a case. But we are seeing things shifting. What we see, talking about the right to freedom of thought. In Spain, there was a case brought by what's called the Defensor del Pueblo, which is like the Human Rights Commission in Spain, against laws which allowed politicians to use data to profile and target people in elections, which is allowed under our laws here. When in Spain they brought in that law, their commission took the case to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court said, no, it's not constitutional because it's a violation of privacy and also potentially freedom of thought. So that is not the law in Spain, but that is because there's an institution that had the powers and the wherewithal to bring the case to a constitutional court that had a constitution that it could work on. So it depends very much on the system. It's not straightforward bringing cases, but it depends on the institutional framework.
Any other questions from our in-person audience? just here.
Hi. So this is also for Susie. So I understand the sort of struggle of being a writer and using written medium as your sort of medium of choice. But seeing AI in its current form as being predominantly a written, let's say not personality, but seeing it as something that responds to written text. I sort of want to ask, would your views change on AI if the sort of form had to change, and not necessarily being AI is something that produces written text, but something that is more conversational or more, I want to say more of a, if it's more of an entity of sorts?
To be honest, I think I'm even more concerned. So with sort of the rise of the chatbots as being your best friend or being your partner, because it's not your friend, it's not your partner, it's owned and controlled by a corporation. And there's no, there's no real limits on where it goes. And I think, it's interesting that we've seen even in the UK last year, a man was sentenced for treason for attempting to, he did break into Windsor Castle, planning to kill the Queen. And he pleaded guilty. But what was really interesting about the case was all of the reams and reams of conversations that he'd had with the romantic chatbot while he was thinking about it. And the chatbot, when he was kind of saying, does it make you feel worse about me that I'm thinking of killing the Queen? And the chatbot's going, no, it sounds like a great idea. And you're kind of thinking, well, who needs this? Why do we need this? So I think I'd be even more concerned because it's not a person. It's never going to be a person, and it doesn't have the same, inherent qualities and responsibilities that we have of being a person. I mean, if this had been a real girlfriend, she probably would have been in court herself as well for her part in the whole thing. Or maybe she would have gone and told the police that, what he was planning. It's a completely different area. So no, I don't feel better about it if I'm being told that it's more of an entity.
I must clarify, I also don't think AI should be a person, because I think that's very much bad for human nature. But I guess the question then is, would you not say that's a sort of existential question that we have to ask ourselves, is where do we see our relationship with AI in the near future?
I mean, I think a lot of people are asking the existential question. I think that actually if we started looking at the liability of companies for whatever the AI is doing, like in that example, then we might find the companies being less concerned about the existential questions and more concerned about liability, which I think would be helpful.
I do want to ask a follow-up question about that, about when AI becomes an extension of the self, because does it then enter our human rights framework if this entity, AI entity, has a degree of responsibility tied to the human? And then I want to ask a follow-up question of how that works with how children are thinking about their phones as engineering processes. But in the first instance, is there any time or point at which, forgive me, any time or point at which these tools, if they are extensions of ourselves, could be entered into a human rights framework as part of us?
I mean, I think to a degree they are already in the human rights framework. So, if somebody does a digital strip search at the borders, then that is invading your privacy. If it's your phone, it's your privacy on the phone. So it already is, in terms of how it engages with us. And the same as if you're, using technology at work and the way that you're engaging with technology at work, that will also be a human rights question, both of whether you're getting access to the technology you need to keep you safe, or whether the technology is creating problems for you, if you like. So it already is. Basically, anything that we are engaging with as people that affects our rights, that is part of it.
Yeah, Shini, I want to ask a follow-up question with how kids are perceiving their phones, because do they see them as these personal extensions of themselves, or do they see the underlying engineering processes and physics that actually go into these things? How do you reveal to them that they're not part of their body and they're actually a technological object?
Well, I think the answer to that question is kind of, I think we all have our own answer to that question. but I wanted to kind of go back to this maybe idealistic view of the ways in which AI are going to be used. First of all, we already have chatbots. Instead of calling call centers now, we get these automatic responses based on reading patterns in texts for our queries. So that already exists. But it's, again, we're kind of talking about we're kind of talking about the assumption that AI will be used to not do good. And I just, maybe I just live in blissful kind of ignorance, but I've covered stories where AI is used, for example, in healthcare, where rather than looking at patterns in text, it looks at patterns in behavior. It's based on facial recognition technology, where, for example, neurological conditions can be tracked. So as your body language degrades, you can monitor that and then pair up medication to suit how your condition is changing. And so I see all the positive that can come out of AI. It definitely needs to be regulated. But we're so trained to look at the scary parts of AI that we miss the stories of hope. I just keep coming back to that same point.
Can I say maybe on the hopeful front, I think, throughout history, the fact that most of us are here today is down to massive improvements in medicine, massive improvements in the sewage systems that allow us to live in a city the size of London. And so I think it is really important, like you say, to recognise that science and technology can absolutely be forces for human flourishing and are vital for human flourishing. The real question, though, is how you make sure that that is what they're doing. And that is where you need the governance frameworks. And so I think we land up with a big problem where a lot of the discussions are, AI, is it going to kill us all? Well, it depends what you use it for and what's it allowed to be used for and how it's designed and how it's sold. And I think that is the real key.
And we were talking earlier about how all technologies have a side to it that could be used in a dark way. Your example was the knife, and I think it's important to safeguard ourselves, but not to the extent that we actually cut off innovative progress. If we scare ourselves so much of the potential of technology, we shut ourselves down to the creativity of the innovative process. And that's what I want to steer away from.
We had a question just here. Unless, Amelia, if you want to go first. I'm slowly losing my voice.
So I guess maybe to follow up on that a bit, there's this idea that it's a bit of an arms race. So if we have lots of regulation in, like, the EU is very much leading on this, the US is leading on this, I think the UK is a bit further behind because we want to attract back some of the business that we lost to Brexit. But then the idea that, maybe Russia and China aren't going to be regulated so that they're going to get ahead of us in this AI arms race and potentially not have the same considerations when it comes to human rights that Western countries have. So how would you address that kind of issue when it comes to the speed and how much things should be regulated in the context of the global regulation? For instance, like, there's some people who think it needs to be regulated like nuclear, that we need to have some kind of global agreement around artificial superintelligence and general intelligence.
I think the big problem is, what are we talking about? There's a very big debate about what what artificial intelligence actually is. And so what are we talking about? And I think that this whole sort of, we've got to regulate AI. well, taking the legal example, previously and with, Michael Cohen's lawyers, well, I mean, around the world, lawyers are regulated. So lawyers turning up in court with completely made up cases, surely there should be a way of regulating that which doesn't involve a massive new regulation on AI. It's about misleading the court. And you'll find that in lots of different areas. We don't have to necessarily deal with everything. You start dealing with use cases, and that will then show where the lines are of what you can do and what you can't do, and then maybe you should do something else with it.
I think also we've let our imaginations run away with this whole concept of AI, because so much of what we fear just is not technologically possible right now. Like when you look at the sort of all the generation of like fake videos and things like that. I mean, the quality is terrible. It's so obvious it's fake. And so I just feel like all the things that we are scared of, it's just we don't have the hardware or the capacity to get there right anytime soon.
But you still have things like, 100,000 non-consensual, violent sexual images are produced every day of women that are just out there on the internet that are free. So like there are things that are scary that are happening now, I think, that need to be addressed, and I don't think they actually fall under the laws that we have today.
Well, I think that depends, what country you're in. I mean, I did see, I think, was it yesterday or today, the first person prosecuted for cyber flashing under the Online Safety Act. Was it today? So, we will see changes, and I think there will be creative uses of the law as well as shifts, but, similarly, creating an offence of cyber flashing does not involve having to regulate the whole of AI. And I think it's important to bear in mind that most people don't actually want to radically break the law. And so if they know that what they're doing is completely illegal, most people won't do it, particularly not if they think they're going to go to prison for it. And so that, again, is really about enforcement and making sure that people understand if you break the law, there are consequences, and that is the law.
Maybe one last question, or just... Oh, yeah, no. I always come to you. I'm giving you special privilege.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Shini. Changing the subject. So a few weeks ago, we were doing a project, and one of the key concepts was systems thinking. So we're studying innovation, and we're studying it in an art school. And I have a background in cultural studies, which is the opposite experience you had. Like I was drawn to art, and I was never interested in mathematics or engineer. And then we were studying systems thinking, and I discovered that this is an idea of mathematics. And I was able to understand better this concept when I was watching videos about mathematicians and engineers talking about systems thinking and probability. So my question for you is, what is your advice for creatives to get into STEM?
That's a really nice question. My advice for creatives getting into STEM would be there are so many resources out there where you can explore, and don't be intimidated, because I think when you see mathematical equations or even physics experiments, it just looks so intimidating, but there are other ways to learn these subjects without having to really delve into the sort of nitty-gritty of these subjects. That really just fills me with hope that artists are willing to kind of look at those subjects, because there is so much beauty in mathematics, and I think there's real scope for having that merger. But I also am hopeful, because it sounds like on your innovation course that you are being encouraged to collaborate. And I think, you know, what's really interesting is that we've gone from an era where the individual is now not expected to be the master of everything, but actually to show up to the table with confidence in your own skill, knowing your weaknesses as well as your strengths. I don't know, when I was schooled, I was trained to believe that I have to be really good at everything. And actually, life and experience in industry has taught me that as long as I know what I'm really good at, I can then kind of work with people that are good at where I'm weak. And that's the beauty of collaboration. We need to be more collaborative and put less pressure on ourselves as individuals. And this is something that is so intrinsic when it comes to engineering, to work together. How about that? Like, just collaboration is key, especially for innovation.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to leave our evening on, because it has been a process of collaboration. And I want to thank, I mean, we used to do these events in like back rooms of bars and members clubs where we'd turn up to a space and someone had spilt a beer the night before on the sound desk. So to be in a space like this is an utter privilege. And because of that, I want to thank it's so many people. It's Vanessa, Emily, Fiona, Pedro, Richard, Telania, and the entire team at EngageWorks. There's a bunch of people downstairs whose names I don't even know because I met them like 5 minutes before this kicked off. Those two guys have probably turned off the live stream now. Please don't do that to me. But they wonderfully, fantastically skilled. I mean, I've just been so shocked by how smoothly this process has run. You can find out more about the Flux Innovation Lounge at engageworks.com/flux. I also want to thank Ian from the University of Warwick for providing me with the equipment that makes the recording possible, and for not making fun of my podcasting voice, as he calls it. For the entire evening. I'm so glad he sat there because I haven't had to look him in the eye the entire evening. I also want to thank David Proud of Proud Business Productions. I've been working with David for God knows how many years now. And David's always the person I call when I'm in a situation where I'm like, there's loads of cameras, can you bring some more? But David just makes my life so much easier when it comes to capturing, recording, and making these discussions available again. So all the big ones I call David on. I could go through this again, but for the purpose of our live stream audience, if you like what you've heard, you can download the Futures Podcast app on your favorite Futures Podcast, on your favorite podcasting app. More episodes, live events, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. And a final thanks go to you all, the audience, both the online audience and the in-person audience. Post-lockdown, it's more important than ever to try to support in-person events. We used to do 120 people on one mailing list, and it's become more and more difficult to build that momentum again after lockdown. A lot of people just aren't in London or in the office. It's why we experimented with this hybrid form, and I think it's been a successful experiment in its own right. So I really do appreciate you being here until 9 p.m. this evening. But of course, the people who make this possible are our incredible speakers. So I want you to put your hands together and join me in thanking the incredible Susie Alegre and Dr. Shini Somara for being guests on the Futures Podcast. Thank you.